I'm really just going to do a very quick overview about why we invited Ted. I mean, I think most of you who are in strategist practice will know why we've invited him, but to really celebrate this body of work that is so incredibly informative. And just to give you an idea, these are the 3 books that were very important to me, and I think that you all will have known and read and cited these books. But we are not alone here in strategist practice. These 3 books between them have over 7,500 citations. And then Ted's chapter, which is the introduction to the edited book, the practice, the practice turning contemporary theory, has another nearly 2,000 citations. So I think we could really say that whether you set out to be a founder of the practice turn for those of us in many fields and looking through the types of people who are citing, it's everything from education to music to management to technology. It's just fantastic to have you here with sort of the underpinnings you've given to so many different fields of study. But in particular, I think for us in strategist practice, increasingly Schatzki's work's been important because we're always trying to deal with this issue of however we want to talk about what people do, people's actions, and how we can make sense of them. And essentially we can see that what this work is, it's a theory of action, and it's a way of theorizing social life that we are looking for as our underpinning theorization of what is strategy as practice, given that it's not just what people do in an a-theoretical or an empirical sense, but what does it mean to be doing in the way that they are. And in particular, I think the thing that's been really useful for us is, there's been this long debate in strategist practice because one of the first special issues was about micro-strategizing. And thereafter, for some reason, people pinholders, they're just those people who study micro stuff, as if the micro could ever be removed from the macro. And so we spent most of our time trying to address that mistake in that first title. The papers weren't all about that, but unfortunately the title got people thinking that there was something about levels of analysis here. And so increasingly we've seen papers, and I think particularly thinking of the Simon and Whittington piece, that tried to draw together the corpus of work and say we were looking for flatter ontologies, ways that we could explain the entanglement of the local in the global, the micro in the macro. And definitely there, obviously they cited Schatzki, but many of us, as we began to get frustrated with other social theories of practice, turned increasingly to this body of work. And certainly I know that institutional theorists have used this work to try and explain how practices build collective understandings, general understandings. We ourselves have used this in a book that we wrote about the global marketplace, where we were looking at how a global marketplace is instantiated across many different local situations, and how actors who never see each other are able to trade in products across a global market, across multiple sites. And so Ted's work's been very, very instructive in terms of, I think, our field, ourselves, and also for me personally. But the great thing is, he's actually launched into some new stuff for us. So today you're going to talk about what will be his forthcoming book, so I feel really privileged that we get the sneak preview.
Thanks, Paula, for that generous introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. And thanks to everybody who had a hand in inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be at my first Academy of Management meeting, and I even got dressed up for the occasion. If you have a suit, you have to wear it sometimes. So I've been on sabbatical last year and working on a book, and I thought, and I was encouraged to provide a sort of overview of what I've been working on, and I've organized this overview in the form of a series of propositions, which are up there with the parenthetical symbols, separating them all. And so I'm just going to work through this. I should say, in addition, that the empirical material I work with in the book is twofold. You'll see, I mention this because you'll see me refer to it from time to time without, except for at the end of the presentation, systematically developing it all. So the first empirical material is select large-scale episodes from the history of bourbon distilling in the state of Kentucky where I live. I actually don't like bourbon, but I do like writing about local phenomena, and bourbon is an interesting one. And the second empirical material concerns what would be standardly described in sociology as group formation through digital media. Though I say standardly formulated because one of the issues in looking at the formation and dissolution of associations through digital devices is whether concepts like group make sense. Okay, so this is organized into 4 sections, and why don't we go in? Oh, and by the way, I wear my disciplinary background in the form of reading my presentations, so I'll apologize or not apologize for that. And why don't we start? Okay, so the book's theses about social change and explanation derive from general ideas about event, process, and change. The starting point is a metaphysical proposition, namely that change arises from events and processes. This proposition might seem intuitively obvious to some or many of you. There exists a range of what philosophers call categories. Categories are basic, generic types of entity. Examples include substance, relation, structure, event, and process. The existence of substances, relations, and structures is compatible with the world being static, that is, changeless. Whatever substances, relations, and structures exist can simply continue existing forever. Events and processes, by contrast, introduce dynamism into the world, things happening or unfolding. A world that contains events and processes cannot be static. Intuitively, consequently, it makes sense that change arises from events and processes. The second proposition up there is that the categories of event and process should be distinguished. Now there's a long argument behind this, and here's a short argument. According to my intuitions, the concept of process connotes something flow-like in character. That is, something continuously unfolding in time. The concept of event, by contrast, connotes happening or coming into existence. Flow, or temporal unfolding on the one hand, and happening, or coming into existence on the other, are not mutually exclusive affairs. A flow of electricity, for example, happens just as the happening of a debate can flow, or not. But the connotations of the two notions pull in different directions, smoothly spread out over time versus coming to be. And this pulls apart the sets of entities that instantiate the two concepts. Processes are continuous and spread out over time, whereas events can be discontinuous and occur at an instant. Consequently, it makes sense to treat them as distinct categories. The next question is, with which conception or conceptions of process should one work? There are 3 prominent general conceptions of process in contemporary social thought. The first and the most widespread is the notion of a sequence of events. The very theoretical sociologist Andrew Abbott writes, for instance, that, quote, "The world of the processual approach is a world of events. Individuals and social entities are not the elements of social life, but are patterns and regularities defined on lineages of successive events," end quote. A more demanding of this version of this pervasive conception is due to the philosopher Nicholas Rescher, who holds that a process, quote, "is an occurrence that consists of an integrated series of connected developments unfolding in programmatic coordination." Don't worry about that. Rescher's conception is more demanding than Abbott's, since it construes a process as a temporal whole whose moments are temporally extended events that are continuous with one another. Now, a second general notion of conception, these are up there under 3, is a pragmatist notion of movement or passage in, through, or by reference to the present, which is usually the present of experience. And finally, a third general conception of process is Bergson's conception, and that is the concept of an ongoing unfolding. Now, the proposition that events and processes should be distinguished counsels against using Abbott's conception of process, which is the most prevalent today. For this conception does not sufficiently distinguish between the two categories. I don't want to work, moreover, with the pragmatist notion, family of notions. Pragmatist notions of process highlight experience. However, many processes that compose or bear on social life, for example, electricity transmission and bacterial infection, do not transpire in or as experience. Many processes, furthermore, that do transpire in experience, for example, a coffee maker making a cup of coffee, can be conceptualized without reference to experience. Consequently, the focus of pragmatist notions on experience diminishes their usefulness for social analysis. Now, I should say as an aside that those of you who are like pragmatism is I have kind of reduced Dewey's conception of experience here. So I acknowledge that, and there's a much longer discussion here. Accordingly, I work in the book with two notions of process: integrated whole nexes of continuous events. So the distillation of bourbon would be an example of that. It's a continuous process. And unfolding advances, that's Bergson's notion, and a good example of that is human activity. All human activities are unfolding advances. Okay, so now let's turn to the notion of change. The starting point here is the idea that events and processes automatically introduce differences into the world. When it rains, for instance, the falling of the drops constitutes a difference between the states of the world before and during the event. Some thinkers hold that change is difference. If this were true, events and processes would automatically yield changes. And of course, you've all encountered the views that everything is changing all the time, right? Now, events and processes certainly institute differences, but whether these differences amount to changes depends on what is juxtaposed with what. So let me explain this. Consider distillation. Each instance of distilling by a particular distiller differs from all previous ones. The exact timing of what the distiller does on the different occasions might slightly deviate. The proportion of the different ingredients that are mixed together might subtly vary. Different amounts of ingredients and cooking temperatures might be achieved. The distillations occur on different days, begin at different moments, and last for slightly different periods, etc., etc., etc. In relation to one another, these micro differences represent changes and are often construed as such. At the same time, however, it might be that nothing really changes from one instance to another of distillation. The same distillation process might occur. The distiller might use the same ingredients and follow the same steps. The results might be the same, and the same distiller might be at work. What's more, the events and processes that are responsible for all those micro differences are the very events and processes that affect this lack of change, that is, that are responsible for the persistence of the same over time. Indeed, the fact that the micro differences and the persistence of the same have a common origin is grounds for saying that the micro differences amount not to changes, but to what we might call fluctuation, a forgotten concept these days. In order for change to have occurred, significant differences need to have taken place. Possible examples include following a different formula of ingredients, using a different wood for fuel that burns at a different temperature and yields something, a difference, a new master distiller starting work, and so on. When any of these things take place, a change might have occurred to the process. It might no longer be the same. Of course, even if the distillation process does change, the distillery where it occurs might stay the same. Other differences are needed for the distillery to change. For example, being bought out by a larger outfit, moving to an entirely new production facility, abandoning the production of bourbon for the production of rye, and so on. Hence, change is not difference simpliciter. It is significant difference. And what qualifies as a significant difference depends on what is juxtaposed with what. It also rests on the volume and nature of further differences that arise consequent on differences of interest, including those that arise from people's reactions to the differences involved. What qualifies as significant also rests on judgments of significance by those who are observing, writing about, analyzing. If the distiller alters the mash formula or the placement of or rotation of barrels in the storage house, and later rejects the resulting whiskey as inferior in quality, nothing has changed. If that formula, or the different placement or rotation, instead produces a great new taste, and other distillers notice it and themselves experiment commensurately after the new product hits the market, change has occurred. Significance, in short, is a contextual matter, dependent both on human judgment and on states, as well as occurrences in the world. Okay, so you'll be glad to know that that's the end kind of the philosophy part of this talk. Okay, so much for general considerations pertaining to events, processes, and change. I do want to say, though, it's important to get these notions precisely. I think it leads to a much more clairvoyant empirical analysis in the end if one is clear and precise about these concepts. Okay, however, before we can turn to social change and its explanation, one more preliminary must be attended to. This is the nature of social life and social phenomena. No conception of change can morph into a notion of social change without some understanding of what social phenomena are. Now, social life, as I understand, is the coexistence or hanging together of human lives. So we'll just put aside animals and all the non-humans for the moment. Elsewhere, I have defended the proposition that social life inherently transpires as part of bundles of practices and material arrangements. Such bundles connect to form broader constellations, and the broader constellations themselves connect and make up one overall complex, which I call the practice plenum. This plenum is a plentitude, a sum of particular things that, as such a sum, amounts not to a bigger thing, but simply to a multiplicity. Just as the bundles and constellations that make up the plenum are nothing but the practices and arrangements and relations that constitute them, the plenum is the entirety of the practices, arrangements, and relations that compose it. It follows that social phenomena are aspects of, slices of, or rooted in bundles of practices and arrangements, that is, in the practice plenum. A bourbon distillery, for example, embraces such practices as distilling, public relations, strategic planning, shipping, facility maintenance, and so forth, that are carried out amid, with, and through arrangements composing the production and storage facilities, the home office, the loading area, the visitor center, and so on. Now, you might see where this is going. Social changes are by definition changes in social phenomena. If, consequently, social phenomena are aspects of, slices of, or rooted in bundles of practices arrangement, social changes, that is, changes in social phenomena, are or are rooted in configurations of changes in such aspects or complexes. Social changes thus embrace configurations, sometimes complex configurations of such changes. To explicate social changes, consequently, it is necessary to discuss changes in practice, arrangement, bundles, and constellations. So that's what part 2 here is about. Doing this, in turn, requires understanding the composition of such bundles and constellations. The key components of bundles and constellations are practices, material arrangements, the relations that link practices and arrangements into bundles, and the relations among bundles that link them into broader constellations. My discussion in the book I've been working on pays considerable attention to the material dimension of the practice plenum, and that is what I'll emphasize here. And just for reference, I have put up there my understanding of what a practice is. That's number 3, just to have it up there as reference. But I'm going to talk about material, the material world. By materiality, I mean intuitively the stuff of things, what fills them out. The kinds of entities I have in mind are diverse, including human bodies, bacteria, rocks, buildings, pencils, software programs, computer processors, air, pools of water, water currents, electrical currents, sunlight, and the atmosphere. This list should make clear that the term material, as I use it, is not restricted to tangible objects, though tangible objects are obviously important ingredients, and rather important ingredients in social life. We're very attuned to tangible items. More specifically, materiality, the word materiality denotes the physical, chemical composition of things. A material entity, consequently, can be defined as any entity with a physical chemical composition. And the adjective material can be used to qualify all properties, events, and processes that pertain to such entities on the basis of their physical chemical composition. The sum of these entities, materials, properties, events, and processes can then be called the material world. So all that is up there under 4. Now, I need to stress that the fact that an entity, for example, a person, an intelligent animal, or a super intelligent robot, that the fact that these entities are material entities is compatible with them possessing properties other than material ones. So, for instance, intelligence, which is not a material property. Or if it is, there has to be an asterisk put on all this, because there are people who say all this will be understood in terms of the physical chemical structure of things eventually. There are some of us who are not going to wait that long to do theory. But so this is the point of saying that entities are material, but that doesn't mean that all properties and processes are material. Furthermore, so there are processes, the fact that these entities are material does not mean that processes other than material ones might befall them. For instance, biological processes, and whether they're material is a point of, it's a fast-moving area, biology. Information processes, processes of intelligence, mental processes, whatever they are, and social processes. Materiality pervades social life by virtue of and mostly in the form of arrangements of material entities. So that's number 5 up here. Several notes about arrangements. First, the expression arrangement does not imply that the material configurations it denotes have been arranged by people. Second, relations among material entities and arrangements help compose social life. So examples are the relations between the different pieces of the production setup at a distillery, or the relation between a family's dogs and cats. But the material entities that are part of arrangements can also bear relations to one another that are not part of social life and might even be independent of it. So an example is the gravitational attraction between the elements of the production setup and the relation of the dogs to the squirrels in the backyard when the dogs are out there by themselves. As this last example suggests, arrangements can also connect up with wider complexes of material entities that are not, or not always, part of social life. And I'll come back to this idea in a moment. Third, as noted, the entities that are part of arrangements need not be relatively discrete, tangible ones. Liquids, including water, gases, including air, and land are examples, though it is usually delimited chunks of water, air, or land that are components of arrangements. So examples are the section of a stream where a boat landing is located. That's what's part of an arrangement, not the stream at large. Beachside currents, fishing grounds, a city's dirty air, and a parcel of land. Now, to move on to all those little arrows, material arrangements bear different sorts of relation to practices. So I'm now going to, at a very high level of generality, to characterize these. First, the material world helps determine how people act. Physical layouts, for instance, channel activities and practices, lest people collide with solid objects. Amazing how much of your life is spent avoiding other solid objects. Material things, events, and processes also induce particular activities as well as prefigure what people do, and those are technical terms. Second, the material world is commanded by practices. This is manifested in practices producing and using material entities, as well as setting up and changing arrangements thereof. Material entities, third, localize activities and practices. All interventions in the world are carried out through performances of bodily actions. Mental activities, too, I believe, are at least partly carried out through bodily performances. As a result, activities are spatially located at the bodies of the people whose voluntary movings constitute the performance of the actions. Thus, at the places where these bodily actions are performed. Practices are similarly but multiply located, namely at all the bodies and material complexes at which their constituent actions are carried out. These locations are likely spread out spatially and temporally, thereby giving concrete meaning to the familiar idea of the spatial temporal extension of practices. The locatedness at bodies of the spatial and intentional the locatedness at bodies of bodily and intentional actions also specifies the spatial trajectory of individual people's actions, which is an important aspect of their life trajectories. And here I make a reference to Hagenstrand's time geography, to those of you familiar with that. Continuing on through this list, we're at the top of the next page. Arrangements also open social life to physical, chemical, and biological events and processes that invade, pass through, or suffuse social life, thereby instituting what Bruno Latour calls matters of concern. Examples are infection, pestilence, and contamination, bodily wear and tear, deterioration and decay of or damage to foodstuffs, technologies, and built environments, equipmental breakdowns, thermodynamic flows, centrifugal forces as undergone on roller coaster rides or on banked high-speed turns, and so on. Light, air, and weather, moreover, are components or states of the material world that suffuse social life, enveloping and permeating bundles and thereby becoming an inescapable social concern. Finally, many of the material connections that link the arrangements of different bundles are also part of social life. Example are roads, doorways, electricity lines, sewer systems, expanses of concrete, ridge lines, ocean currents, satellite communications networks. These connections can be natural or artifactual. Now, let's move on to the last point in this section. Social phenomena are aspects of, slices of, or rooted in bundles of practices and arrangements. There is a broader ecology, however, that's broader than the practice plenum, in which social phenomena exist. And I'm using the word ecology here because the phenomena I'm about to speak about are all capable, under certain conditions, of impacting social life. And so that's the notion of, if you think about what an ecology is, it embraces everything that bears upon how something works. And so typically with like living creatures, that you think of a very diverse ecology that are all relevant to how it works. So similarly, I'm expanding and bringing in other entities that can bear on social life, though often they're not doing so. Okay, so two sorts of phenomena that help compose this broader ecology are, first, material events that lie beyond, though they may connect to, the plenum, and second, what composes the entities that make up the material arrangements that belong to bundles. In this context, it is useful to use the concept of nature and artifact to characterize, though they don't line up with, these two collections of entities. Both artifacts and things of nature lie beyond the practice plenum. The things of nature involved can be described as broader nature. Examples are tubular life in continental rift zones, geological strata beneath the surface of the earth, grizzly bears in the British Columbian wild, earthquakes in El Nino. The artifacts I have in mind are ones that have decayed or been abandoned or forgotten and become detritus. Such entities were once part of the practice plenum but have fallen away from it, even though they can lie about or endure for decades or millennia. Example are sunken ships, forgotten ruins in forests, older cities buried under present-day ones, and remnants of past material infrastructures encased or lying about in present-day built environments. It's remarkable, if you walk around any city, like the one here, you see little bits of old infrastructure encased in the current material setups. The reason why, as I said, the reason why I say that artifacts and things of nature that lie beyond the practice plenum are part of the ecology of social life is that it is always possible for such entities to suddenly bear on social life in some way, as they do sometimes. Furthermore, the entities that make up the arrangements that are part of the practice plenum have physical, chemical compositions. These compositions can be artifactual, as when people manufacture the materials that go into something. For example, a cell phone, which is largely made up of manufactured materials. Some of what composes any entity, however, is natural. And the natural phenomena involved can be dubbed inner nature, with apologies to the Frankfurt School. Examples are the physical chemical composition of mesas, the basic anatomical structure of humans or other organisms, and chemical bonds among the ingredients of bourbon or among the materials that compose the glass, wires, and liquid crystal display that make up cell phone screens. The ecology of social life thus includes broader nature and forsaken or decayed artifacts on the one hand, and inner nature on the other. But it has one more component, namely, and you might be surprised, life trajectories. Human activities are at once parts of individual lives and components of social practices. Because of this, the life trajectory of an individual person episodically coincides with different practice arrangement bundles. At the same time, individual life trajectories proceed on the background of bundles, dependent on bundles, and through bundles. It follows that life trajectories on the one hand and bundles on the other are distinct phenomena. They, together with broader and inner nature, forsaken and decaying artifacts, and the practice plenum form the ecology of social life, or of society. Comprehending particular social phenomena always requires grasping the practice arrangement bundles of which they are aspects or slices, but it often also requires attending to life trajectories that pass through these bundles, and it is at their own peril that investigators and others forget forsaken artifacts or entities of broader and inner nature. Okay, so now we can move on to the main point, which is social change. Okay, we've now accumulated the material needed to discuss social change. Social phenomena consist in aspects and slices of bundled practices and arrangements. Accordingly, social changes, that is, changes in social phenomena, are configurations of changes in such bundles. As discussed, moreover, changes, generally speaking, arise from events and processes. Social changes, consequently, must arise from events and processes that befall or bear on practice arrangement bundles. And I argue in the book that there are two general sorts of event or process that dynamize bundles and bear responsibility for changes in them. The first is chains of activity, and the second are material and other events and processes. So that's proposition 3.2. A chain of actions is a series of actions, each member of which reacts to a prior action in the chain or to a change in the world that the prior action brought about. The idea is familiar from the work of Gabriel Tard, Andrew Abbott, and Bruno Latour. In acting, people usually extend chains of action, even though they are often unaware that this is occurring. They are focused on whatever they react to and usually ignorant of the activities and other events or states of affairs that make up the chains that eventuated in this. In simply going about one's business over the course of the day, one extends a myriad of action chains, which thereby pass through one's life. Activity chains also circulate in individual bundles and cross multiple ones. Now, activity chains have a number of significant features, only some of which I will mention here, and only in passing. First, they embody causality of two sorts: people intervening in and altering the world, and features of the world inducing people to act. As a result, chains of action amount to, you might say, threads of causality in social life. Chains also form loops, or, in acknowledging the temporal dimension, spirals. Spirals are important because they can effectuate feedback and thereby facilitate strong, unintentional directional change of kinds today discussed under the rubric nonlinear dynamics. Chains, in addition, hang together and form nexes of chains, thereby becoming responsible for hosts of connected changes in one or more bundles. Chains of action are also informed and shaped by the bundles through which they pass. And each additional activity in a chain inflects that chain, either considerably, somewhat, or infinitesimally. Finally, there are a number of prominent types or subtypes of change, including interaction, dialogue, exchange, and governance. Now, another important type embraces a vast dominion of haphazard and undirected chains. Such change typically occur when people respond to changes in the world that others have brought about, utterly ignorant of the others involved, even that what they are responding to is an effect of some person or persons' actions. Suppose that someone who picks up a piece of trash on the sidewalk and throws it into a bin extends a change of actions, whose preceding component is the litterer throwing the trash out of a car window in response to his companion complaining about the messy automobile, and whose succeeding component is a city employee emptying the overflowing bin. The good citizen and the city employee probably have no knowledge of who is responsible for the states of affairs to which they react. This would have been equally the case if the good citizen had initiated a chain as opposed to extended it. For instance, if the litterer had just absent-mindedly thrown the trash on the ground in response to nothing. People endlessly react to features of the world that others are responsible for, and therewith unwittingly extend chains. They also unwittingly initiate chains when others react to what they've done. It is haphazard or circumstantial which lives such chains connect, and participants have no specific knowledge of the other participants, and maybe also no inkling that their lives are interconnected. Social life is full of such chains. These chains are often trivial and irrelevant in the emerging state of the world. They can, however, under the right circumstances, contribute to significant changes. And I'm going to skip over where is it here? Number 6, I'm going to skip over. All this talk about chains of action does not give any prominence to the individual or individual actions in explaining social changes. And I'm going to, that's a dense idea to explain, so I'm just going to skip over that presently. Now, I should add that material things, events, and processes can be crucial components of and supports for chains of action. Material properties and movements of the human body, for example, are essential to the performance of bodily actions. They thereby underlie the performance of actions and, as a result, the occurrence of chains. Material entities, moreover, mediate chains in multiple ways. Sometimes, as noted, changes in the material world brought about by activity are that to which subsequent activities react. An example, students reacting to something their teacher writes on the board. Whenever this occurs, a material object, event, process, or state of affairs helps form a chain of actions. Similarly, material and other events and processes themselves regularly mediate chains by inducing people to act. Lava flows, infestations, and equipmental breakdowns accomplish this as much as do beautiful sunny days. That can inspire action. The antics of pets and the signals that machinery gives us that they've completed their tasks. Material and biological arrangements also often subtend the flow of information through which people learn about actions and state of affairs to which they subsequently react. Now, as some of these examples suggest, the other general sort of cause of social change is material and other events and processes. The events and processes involved can be captured or manufactured in bundles, or impact or intrude into bundles from outside of them. As just mentioned, material events and processes such as lava flows, infestations, and equipmental breakdowns can induce activities. Material events and processes can also directly bring about differences and changes in material entities and in arrangements of such entities. Think, for instance, of how electricity, electrical transmissions, fire, alcohol, decay, and flows of rivers, microbes, wind, and heat affect changes in the material dimension of bundles. Indeed, the existence of the built environment in effect amounts, at least in part, to an effort by humans to capture, transform, create, counteract, link, and utilize material events and processes. By inducing activity and directly affecting material arrangements, material events and processes can lead to social changes. Hence, such events and processes add to the causal threads of activity chains endless additional causal relations and processes. And then I'll skip over the section where I talk about material spaces to become all important. This is too often forgotten in social thought, the significant role that material space plays. Okay, to sum up this discussion of the material dimension of society and its contribution to social change. The relation between material entities and social entities is quite variegated. You know, you often hear that the material world is the substratum. Deleuze talks this way. It's the substratum of social life. And indeed, the material world does underlie and support society. But it also permeates, forms, suffuses, and is encountered, coped with, and constructed in it. So it's a quite complex relationship between materiality. It can't be easily reduced to, easy formulas. Okay, we are now in the position to talk about the explanation of change. Let me check the time. All right. And okay, I'm not going to talk about the first point, the claim that all explanation is causal explanation. I was surprised to see myself make this claim because I've regularly argued against it, but then I realized that if you have a sufficiently broad conception of causality, it's actually a straightforward claim. And so I won't go into the details. It involves drawing on Aristotle and Heidegger to make that, to explicate that claim. Okay, so on this line of thinking, explanations of social changes describe what is responsible for them. Hence the nexuses of activity chains and material events and processes that give rise to them. It follows that all explanations of social changes are historical, though they need not be narrative, and I'll circle around to this point again. Notice that the facts, now repeat the point that the mere fact I'm talking so much about chains of activity does not give any special place to individual people in the explanation of social life. Okay, now in the book, the basic punchline is it's only when individuals make noteworthy contributions to change that understanding their actions is pertinent to understanding social change. The mere fact, like if you were a reductionist and said everything is just human activity, that wouldn't give any individual people any preeminence in explaining social change, right? Unless that individual made an outsized contribution. Okay, now in the book I analyze and give examples of both simpler and more complex social phenomena. And here I just want to emphasize two general points. The first, and I'm just going to have to say this and you have to accept it on faith because spelling it out is too detailed. The first is the causal nexuses that give rise to social changes are multiply contingent, where by contingent I mean happenstance, that is just happening to occur or be the case. The prolonged, how a person reacts to the world is highly contingent. So too is how different chains, and how chains on the one hand and material events and processes on the other connect up to form the causal nexuses that are responsible for sets of changes to bundles of practices and arrangement, that is for more complex social changes. The multiple contingencies of the causal nexuses that ply social life have various implications, including, and this is one I develop at length, is that it's very hard to draw on generalizations to explain change. Now, it has a lot of implications for epistemological implications for social investigation. The second point concerns complexity. Complex social changes, like changes in complex social phenomena, say a popular revolution, or the decline of the world economy consequent on an international trade war, such changes embrace very large numbers of changes in practice arrangement bundles. As a result, they are brought about by very complex causal nexuses, that is, by multitudes of nexuses of activity change in material events and processes. This situation raises a familiar issue. It's been around for a long time. Namely, of how social research can deal with the complexity of social affairs. As noted, the familiar stratagem of applying generalities is undercut by the multiple contingency of social affairs. The more recent stratagem of constructing simulations, I don't know if org studies people do simulations. That, I'm not sure, but plenty of social scientists do. This runs aground on the inability of models to accommodate the variability of human psyches and practices. Explaining complex social changes instead is a matter of giving overviews of the complex, multiply contingent multitudes of nexuses that give rise to them. An overview conveys the gist and significant, salient, or essential features of a field of entities. For instance, an example of such a field is the multitude of interconnected nexuses of chains and material processes that give rise to complex social changes. The idea is Wittgenstein's, who derived it from Goethe. Wittgenstein wrote, quote, that, quote, an overview produces precisely the sort of understanding which consists in seeing the connections, and the German is den Zusammenhang sehen, so that's important, because the Zusammenhang word is very hard to translate. In the social disciplines, overviews produce that sort of understanding which consists in seeing connections among, that is, seeing the overall context, Zusammenhang, formed by the myriads of activities, events, and processes that lead to changes of interest. Now, there is much that should but cannot be said here, but is said in the book about overviews. For instance, about the essential role that judgment plays in them, in the same way that a judge has to exert judgment, so too must the social scientist. The types of concepts that are useful in providing them, and the roles that narratives, descriptions of individual events, generalizations, graphical techniques, and statistics can play in them. So I discuss all these different things in the book. Okay, and I'm going to skip what was the next section here, which is that talking about chains of action and material processes gives a way to account for all the changes in social life that others attribute to such things like power, coevolution, dependence, mechanisms. There's a long discussion of the notion of a mechanism and so forth. And I thought that since this talk has been very theoretical and abstract, I would conclude by just giving you an example of an overview of that's in the book of a particular change, the development of a particular type of new association through digital media. So let me just read that, and then I'll be done. Okay, so the particular association in mind, and I talk about three different ones in the book, and there's a logic to the three. And the middle one is Swedish indie fandom. So indie music fandom. Now that's not a standard group or community. Okay. And this is based on a great article that Nancy Baim wrote about this in 2007. So I commend this, a great article. Okay, the consolidation of Swedish indie fandom took place during the time of what Lee Ramey and Barry Wellman called the triple revolution in social connectedness. The three revolutions are the emergence in the early 1990s of the World Wide Web, the advent in the early 2000s of mass communication through handheld computers called smartphones, and the emergence in the late 1990s of true social networks. There have been lots of social networks that weren't really social networks. Okay. In the late 1990s, promoters, fans, and creators of Swedish indie music constructed and patronized arrays of websites, discussion boards, and soon thereafter, video and photo sharing sites through both phones and computers. Fans constructed sites dedicated to particular bands, promoters built sites that covered or sold their commercial interests, and bands set up sites to promote and sell their music. The glut of sites that resulted formed a metamorphizing mosaic with no central organizing instance. And I had just been discussing an example of a central organizing instance creating a virtual community. So that was the first example I discussed. This situation, oh, here it is. The situation differed dramatically from the one that obtained on the well. If any of you remember this, the whole Earth electronic link. No one remembers this? Okay. I don't either. I only read about it. The well was a single online location with, so to speak, multiple meeting rooms where people could go to interact according to their interests and inclinations. Hypertext in the World Wide Web exploded this organizational form. First, by allowing people of all sorts to create their own places out there, and two, by supporting links among these places, thereby creating a connected mosaic of independent places across which individuals and groups could range in expression, enjoyment, and pursuit of their desires and interests. So that's what we now know today as the World Wide Web. Fans did not come together at a single site, but were dispersed across them. Nor did they interact much with each other. The only groups they formed in the standard notion, the technical notion of a group, centered on shared interests in this or that band. Instead, shifting combinations of fans patronized changing combinations of often multiplying sites, largely at their own initiative. The fact that indie music encompassed multiple genres only further contributed to the fragmentation, as did the fact that different Swedish cities had their own independent music worlds, in Becker's sense. Something else that joined fans and helped them eventually coalesce into a fandom was that the practices they carried on through their cell phones and computers were extensions of fan practices that predated the widespread use of these devices. Examples of earlier fan practices include attending concerts. Many of these still exist. Forming fan clubs, reading and collecting magazines, and accumulating paraphernalia. Not to mention listening to records. When people began increasingly to access websites through computers and cell phones, these practices evolved and were supplemented by additional ones. Tips and shared opinions about songs became shared downloads and links. Concert going was supplemented by the watching of videos. Listening to recordings became listening to downloads. And discussions among friends morphed into discussions on bulletin boards, postings on blogs, or messaging, liking, and interaction on social media. A material infrastructure of servers, computers, and phones was decisive in enabling the fandom to form. Prior to the coming together of this infrastructure, musicians and fans were somewhere isolated where they lived. Indie music got little airtime on national media, and the recordings of particular bands were sold in the towns where they were recorded. It was not until the web appeared that people could access and listen to music that was being played elsewhere. Because, however, the relevant sites were many, people remained scattered. Islands, that's a technical term, formed online, centered on particular websites, especially those connected with particular bands. The nexuses of chains, events, and processes that pervaded the practices fans carried on were disassociated and separate. The practices also did not include much communication. Chains of action linked fans with bands and merchants, but not with one another. These chains thereby contributed to the evolution of bundles, but not to their convergence or merger. The situation changed when the popularity of blogs led people of all sorts who had been members of different islands to begin interacting with one another. Communication chains passing through blogs linked island bundles, and they began to converge and co-evolve. This development quickened with the meteoric rise of social networks. Nexuses of activities, events, and processes passing through social network bundles came to link people and groups who had previously been associated with different sites, thereby further breaking down the islands. The different clusters of fans began to link, shuffle, and merge, and websites of more comprehensive scope were founded. People learned about new sites, new bands, and new music through social networks and sites of broader scope. As in the earlier example of the well, social networking also allowed relations to develop between individual fans. A fuller set of communication practices became part of the constellation of bundles that composed the now coalescing fandom. And here's the last paragraph. After 2008, the constellation further evolved with the introduction of locative software, which allowed fans to converge on and meet in material places, including venues where live music was played. This development deepened the interactive dimension of the fandom, but the fandom did not still form a community. Different combinations of people still patronize different combinations of sites in ways still reflective of geographical location. Fans might bump into each other more often in particular cities, know of more people elsewhere who were into indie music, and know much more about the overall scene. But fans generally felt no great emotional attachment to this large complex of bundles. They might be emotionally attached to particular songs and bands, but the overall constellation simply supported and was the broader site of their interests and tastes in music. They did not share much in the way of a common identity. It's the observer that finds that common, names it Swedish indie fandom. In other words, their existence in the fandom constellation did not merge with the remainder of their lives in the way that, well, the earlier example merged with the lives of the people who were participants in it. For this reason, I think the fandom was some sort of loose, voluntary teleological association, with apologies to Ferdinand Tönnies. A common interest in music oriented the bundles involved and drove fans to take advantage of the new software-based possibilities available. Nancy Baim, the author of this article, calls the fandom constellation a case of what she calls, quote, networked collectivism. She thereby plays off Wellman's idea of networked individualism, which is the idea that social structure in the digital age is increasingly a matter of individuals building overlapping personal networks. So we each have our personal networks, and then we have to connect them together. So she's talking about now collectivism. And what she means is that the coalescence of Swedish indie fandom involved individuals not alone, but together, building up networks of sites and fans. So what she describes is the gradual coalescence of a large, loose, voluntary, teleological organization. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a high, isn't it? This man's just explained an entire social theory of how the world works. Honestly, Ted, I'm very excited by what you've just spelled out in the scope of the new book. And also, I think the potential that it's offering us as organization scholars. And I want to reflect on a couple of things that I was thinking while you were talking. I mean, so the first thing I was thinking is, oh, fantastic. He's done some great definitional work for us again. You know, so we've been trying to deal with the material and what is the material and things like that. We have a special issue on materiality. I remember in 2002, I was trying to publish a paper on bundles of practices and struggling with that. And so I think it's really great that you have brought some more specificity to some of these issues for us in ways that no doubt we may do injustice to your own conceptual baggage, but you will let us get to grips with the empirical world that we're trying to understand and talk about. The other thing that I found really helpful was this notion of these multiple chains of action and the happenstance interaction between them, but also that there is causality here, so people may respond not knowing to what they respond, but nonetheless these things are consequential and perhaps in unintended ways. And it made me think about two things that I think that we're interested in the Academy and that many of us perhaps in this room are interested in. So one is, I remember when we were first looking at companies like Amazon, and I'm a strategy professor, and I was very happy to just take the dictate of, this is all about efficiency, and this is about, improving the efficiency of organization, and we can come up with an explanation for that and talk about these kinds of online markets and online ways of trading. At the same time, a number of us are now concerned about the gig economy, the decline of workers' rights, the decline of high streets and local businesses. And at no stage when we were excited about the efficiency of the technologies of trading, were we also talking about, oh my God, the gig economy is going to arise from this. But now people want to make those connections. And I think the kind of theories that you offer us show this, that these kinds of materials, that they have these happenstance and random ways of almost, well, not necessarily random, but happenstance ways of creating feedback loops to which others react and respond, so that what starts as a great way to be more efficient through a technology maybe leads to one person being the richest person in the world and the rise of a whole lot of other things we're very unhappy about in terms of the decline of high streets, the increase in equity, inequality for some types of workers, gig economy workers and things. So I'm saying it's a very big picture I'm trying to spell out there, but lots of parts of the academy want to explain these things in different ways. And you're showing us the way to link those through the materials that people respond to and use, not knowing that they respond to and interact with each other over time and across different spaces. So I think that's a really exciting thing for me, because it helps me think about the thing I want to explain today as efficient or good or something, or an important practice that maybe I'm just being a little bit short-sighted about because of my own inability to know what I'm responding to. So that's very helpful. And I think it also helps us talk to some of the bigger issues that the Academy itself wants to talk to now. So we want to have a voice in these issues of poverty, inequality, climate change. And I thought your talk about events and processes was fantastic, because I think of things like the climate change agreement, the 2016 climate change agreement, and we can say that's an event, okay, but the process of climate change is a different thing that gets interrupted by an event, and will that event cause change? Only to the extent to which we pay it significance. And perhaps what we need is a range of other things that are of significance, like within that same time period, Paris being at record levels of flooding, 2017 being the biggest year for natural catastrophe ever recorded, hurricanes sweeping through the Caribbean. So maybe we have an event, like a climate change agreement, and we have a series of other natural events, which, as you said, these are not human activated, or these particular things have their own properties outside what we can do. But if we pay them significance because of the moment in which they happen in the unfolding flow, we have a chance to make the sorts of links that might change behaviour. And so I think you offered us a profound theory of social change, but also something that some of us who are interested in trying to understand how people act and whether what our actions do can make a difference is how we can maybe understand significance and when the opportunities are to do more significant action, but also with the humility that must come from knowing that everything we do will have an unintended consequence. So for me, I think it was a great, and I'm really looking forward to the book. I hope it will help me make sense of the stuff I'm looking at. I hope it will also help us in the Academy perhaps take a more optimistic view of our role in social change, but also a more modest view. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So do you want to bring up these questions?
Yeah.
So thank you again, Ted and Paula, for a very insightful and inspiring conversation, even though it's not really a conversation quite. So to make it really interactive, via letter here, with the kind help of Christina, have collected and sifted through the questions that you submitted. So I think, thank you, Ted. I really appreciate you were, I think, smack on time. I saw Paula had a timekeeper. I think we're sort of exactly at the 50 minutes and 20 seconds. So very impressed. Anyway, so Violetta will read out of the questions. We've got between sort of 15 to 20 minutes. So please don't feel shy to elaborate. But I would still like to get through quite a few questions. I think to make sure we engage with various points in the audience.
Okay, so just right away start with the first question that we received by Daniel Doherty from the University of Manchester. He's interested, and I think it's a general interest from the Strategy as Practice community, that we have these 3 Ps, the practitioner, the praxis, and the practices. So what about the practitioners in your conceptualization? So the question here is, in your philosophy, who is driving the car, or rather who or what?
Sorry, there's a second part as well that's important there. Can you do that? Because it's 2-part. Does it make sense without the second part?
So maybe let's just start with the first, with the who is driving the car, the practitioners.
Okay. Well, that metaphor sounds a little bit like Descartes' metaphor of the captain in the ship, and that was supposed to be the subject in the body, the mind and the body. I think of human beings are material creatures. They exhibit, they perform actions, they exhibit, they have mental properties. I think of activities as events that befall people. And the nature of that befalling is that what befalls someone is a performance, which means it befalls you to be responsible for what you've just done. Now that's might sound a little bit like mumbo jumbo. And so there is no driver in the car, if you will. There are processes unfolding and events taking place, and activities are, from the point of view of understanding human social life, a rather important event. They help compose social phenomena, and how they get linked together then provides some causality to change. And part of the idea of the haphazardness of things is to further undercut the idea that there's a driver there, because our actions might largely be intentional. That means you're up to something when you act, but you never have a grasp of exactly where in the progress of the world that intentional action fits. And the chain of action is that sense of you're responding to something, and then other things respond to you, and that chain passes through you in that sense. And so, so what's part two then?
Well, I think that was also partly answered already. So
Does it make sense in your philosophy to pose the question in those terms?
Yes. Well, sure. You can pose the question any way you want. I mean,
Would you pose it in those terms?
I would not formulate the position in those terms. But there's a lot more detail to what one can say on this point.
Okay, then we have another question, which is more around the relation of practice theory to other big theories like institutionalism. So the question here is, from your perspective, from the perspective of your theory, how would you conceptualize institutions and institutionalization?
Okay. So there was a what do they call these? PDW that I was part of on this topic 2 days ago. And I began by saying I have not read a lot of what you all call institutional theory, but I've always been puzzled by what an institution is supposed to be. Because there's a lot about institutional this and institutional that, but there's nothing about what an institution is. And so I can only draw on my intuitions, which are formed by the fact that the notion of institution is widely used in the social sciences. And I think the common denominator to this, usage is the idea of something durating over time, usually longer lengths of time, where longer is always relative to something else. And that's what an institution is. So anything can be an institution. Any component of social life can be an institution if it durates long enough. Now, that's of course not what is meant by institutional theory doesn't say, it just talks about institutional logics and institutional fields and things like that. But the way, in this session, there was supposed to be an interaction involving Roger Freeland and myself. And so what I had prepared for that was a sense in which practice theory and institutional theory can form an alliance. Now this is a general theme that I've been writing about recently, that practice theory cannot be a theory of everything. There are a variety of aspects or features of human life that one cannot expect what is more precisely or narrowly conceived of as practice theory as being able to provide and account for. And so practice theory has to join up and bring in other forms of theory. Now, one of these could be institutions. So the way I sketch this is the notion of the plenum of practices that I was talking about. One could wonder whether there are there large sectors of that practice plenum. I mean, I've been talking about bundles and constellations of bundles, but normally things like the economy, whatever that is, you might think of as a sector in some sense, and then institutional analysis might tell you about an economy that is the institutional logic or logics, the institutional substance that are involved there. And that might give you materials with which to conceptualize large-scale sectors of the practice plenum. And those ideas don't come from practice theory, right? Because it's rather, the ideas come from elsewhere, but then are kind of fit into, or fit along, or allied, joined with a practice ontology. And so that's one way of thinking about this. But I find it hard to answer the question because I'm not really sure what an institution is. And just saying that something that durates for long lengths of time is an institution, well, there it is. That's what an institution is. And institutionalization becomes an interesting concept then, because that's like asking, how has it come about that things last for long periods of time in social life? And that's a very hard question to ask. I mean, this is like Brodell's A Longue Durée. It's not, and he basically didn't try to explain it. I mean, it's just there. Some things it's almost inertial, the inertial dimension of human society. So anyway, but bringing in more specific notions like in institutional theory, there's a possibility of then working them together.
Would you like to add something to that, Paula?
No, I'm very happy with that explanation of what is an institution. Thank you.
That's Radcliffe Brown's definition, by the way. A great anthropologist, British anthropologist.
There's another question about the generalizability of social change that you mentioned before. So the question is, what implication? So you said it's hard to generalize social change. So what implications does this have for the empirical research?
Right. So I'm not going to go into the argument, but the basic idea is if things are multiply contingent, the only generalizations that cover the case are very general. And being very general, they don't provide backing or insight into the particular cases. And to understand the particular cases, you need to sort of get in there and see what's going on. But of course, social life is very complex, and getting in there into the details can, be like a labyrinth, and you never get out and, are able to write up your research, or your research becomes very, very diffuse. And so that's where I was trying to offer the notion of an overview as a substitute for that. So no, I mean, you always have to be sensitive to the particulars of whatever it is you're studying, because you never know which particulars really made a big difference. And so you want to be open to capturing that, and yet you don't want, your analyses cannot be just simply a compilation of particulars. And so that's the sense of giving an overview where you capture what's essential and salient and significant about things. And what goes into making an overview will always depend on particular cases. You might want to draw on statistics, generalizations might pick out certain features, you might tell a story about a very particular incident that took place because it's illustrative of something broader, or it was actually the moment when something important that then sort of floriated afterwards and led to bigger, multiple changes in different sites. And so it's always tied to the particular thing being studied, what form this overview takes. But the idea is to, it requires, it's more of an art. You have to have a certain flexibility of drawing on these different, whether it's graphical techniques, generalizations, etc. These things to capture, to be able, and there's always a communicative intent to the whole thing. That is, you're trying to communicate what's essential and salient about a field of entities or a situation to your audience. So that would be other researchers largely, or it might be policymakers, or it might be the general public if you're writing. And I mean, in some ways, historians are very good at this. I mean, in some ways, this is kind of the method of history, except that, I would leave a lot more room for generalization, statistical, graphic techniques than I think a lot of historians would generally And the last thing I'll say about this is it does make all explanation historical. You're always interested in what is responsible. How did things come about the way they did? But that gives no privilege to the notion of narrative. It's not like, as most historians do, you're supposed to write narratives. No, you might just have some really cool graphs that really capture somehow what's going on, and that you've communicatively conveyed then the gist, what's salient, what's so yeah.
So here's another question to Paula. So could you reflect a bit on the term social materiality that is used a lot in the versus this notion of materiality or material bundle arrangements? So in what way would we use which terms, and what do these terms allow you to see?
I actually think that's quite an interesting question, and I would need some more time to absorb what you were saying about materiality. But I appreciated that you gave us the definition you did, which I need to go back and look at, but about this physical, chemical nature. And when we talk about socio-materiality, and you'll remember that was that big thing where Leonardi was saying there's no such thing as socio-materiality because that which is material is social. And so we don't need socio-materiality because it's a tautological term. If we talk about materiality, we already talk about social. But I actually think you provide us with a better way to define that some aspects of the material are not within the social, and that if we want, so to actually give better specification to when we talk about socio-material, maybe we are really talking about interactions of humans with material. And as you point out, there are some aspects of material. I mean, I love some of your examples, like, for example, you just walk around trying not to bump into things. You're not conscious of that, but there is a materiality to the way you simply move through a space. And so, is it the material that's social, or is it me and my moving and not hitting everything that is social? And I actually think you've provided a nice distinction there, because there was a little bit of a, well, if everything is material, if it's only something when it's used, it's like this notion of resourcing in use, then do we need both terms, because really all that is material is social? But I think you actually reinstate a little bit of quite nice common sense to that. Also in the sense of these big things, these phenomena, these El Ninos, these earthquake plates, these tectonic plates. I mean, there are things which are beyond the social to which we respond. And so I found that very helpful, and I think it will give better specification, because a lot of us are trying to deal with socio-materiality, and I think it's still a very untapped area in our research, but obviously ripe for a lot of opportunities.
Well, I mean, it's not a term I would use, because I analyze social phenomena by reference to bundles of practices in materiality. So, I mean, you don't have the two things to hook together that way. But there may be similar impulses. I think the impulse is to pay it recognition to the material, which, as the story goes, which is only half true, that it had been ignored in previous decades.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. So, Ellen Knight from the University, we would like to know what accounts for how chains emerge. So, you talked a lot about the chains as a source for change. So, how do these chains emerge?
Well, the idea is actually very simple. I mean, everything we do involves a reaction to something. That it is something that we actually are responding to, or in the light of which we're acting. So we're always reacting to things. In reacting to them, we thereby link to them. So the idea of a chain is something where each link occurs retrospectively in a way. And it's built by a series of retrospective linkings, that is, reactions to things that already exist or have occurred. And then it moves through time with each reaction. And so it lies in the nature of human activity that this occurs. It's like just the idea that human activity involves motivation. That is, you're reacting to things. And that's just very fundamental. It's what Heidegger called the past. you know, to bring temporal concepts into the analysis of human activity. And then there's the future dimension too, but that's more like how you're linking, not to what you're linking.
And finally, Mark Thunder from the Liverpool University would like to know, so is there something bigger than nexuses? Is there something, an option to go beyond the synthesis and what Zusammenhang is?
Could I qualify that quite specifically? Among the dynamics of these chains.
The what?
The dynamics of these chains that you elaborate. And I'm thinking specifically of feedback processes, as in cybernetics, the intensification. So is it enough to have to summon down a syncretism perspective, or can we say something more about the actual dynamics? Intensification, homeostasis, schismogenesis. I'm invoking the cybernetic language here. Can you say something specific about dynamics?
Well,
rather just the saying, really going to hang together things.
So, I mean, I think I understand the question. There's a lot of discussion of causality in the book, and it just sort of got thrown in here. And the reason for that is that's where things being responsible for other things actually exist. And I do think it's actually spelled out on this level at which we're reacting to each other. And part of the art of the overview is finding concepts that can capture, if you will, that can somehow put into a concept a very complex field of this. So there are, you know, all kinds of concepts that one could use. So cybernetic, that whole language probably falls afoul of contingency, I think. So you need there are all kinds of concepts that people have offered that would allow you to capture at a broad stroke a complexity of particular action chains and material processes. And then the question is, you know, can you see patterns in it maybe? But that's pretty empirical realist kind of way of approaching at that point, to look for those patterns. It's darn hard. I mean, the greatest historians have a knack at it, but only the greatest historians. I think I'm thinking of somebody like McNeill, who I'm really a big fan of, who is just incredible. His ability to give you a sense of the whole thing in a few sentences is just remarkable. But to me, he's giving an overview, and he's gotten the right concepts to link on what's really essential and salient. And to me, that's what social science is about, to try to do that using whatever material helps you do it.
Thank you very much for the answer. Thank you for your questions.
That was really
Thank you.
inspiring last point. That's what social science is there to do, so just do it, whatever means you have.
So I'm not sure, I don't know how many of you agree, but I'm not sure how many people outside this room would agree. So.
Anyway, it's been really a very insightful discussion, and thank you so much. I think I can speak for all of us for allowing us to get a bit of a sneak preview of your book. You know, your work has really inspired a lot in the past, and I think, you know, today was just another great example to demonstrate how you know, your continuation of your own work will sort of really have a very strong connection with, you know, sort of our community. And here I mean really the broader organization theory community, as well as the strategy community. So let's thank Ted and Paula once more for their very engaging discussions, and thank you for your very inspiring questions.
Thank you.
In closing, you know, Ted had mentioned in the past when he visited Brisbane that Kentucky really suffers of the import and distribution of beer in particular, even though he enjoys, you know, the flavor of beer. So therefore, we thought we'll import, you know, a few beers from the world. So this is, you know, the gift. I just thought this is, you know, something memorable, hopefully. So thank you.
Right, thank you.
Hopefully, this will mean we could have you back in future, you know. And,
to get more beer. Right.
Thank you, Paula. And thank you. This concludes the keynote. So
Very gendered prizes.
We can switch.
Please stick around. I think Ted's flight might not leave, until sort of 5-ish, so you might have a bit of time to maybe engage in conversations. Thank you again.
All right, thanks.